How is the nose positioned relative to the ears? Lateral, medial, distal, or superior? Medial. The nose is closer to the midline that divides the body into left and right halves. How are the eyes positioned relative to the nose? Medial, lateral, deep, or distal? Lateral. The eyes are farther from the midline of the body. How is the chin positioned relative to the nose? Inferior, anterior, medial, or superior? Inferior. The chin is located below the nose. How is the forehead positioned relative to the nose? Lateral, inferior, superior, or posterior? Superior. The forehead is located above the nose. How are the lips positioned relative to the teeth? Lateral, posterior, anterior, or medial? Anterior. The lips are in front of the teeth. How is the tip of the nose positioned relative to the bridge of the nose? Posterior, anterior, medial, or inferior? Anterior. The tip is the most forward-facing part of the nose. How are the eyebrows positioned relative to the eyes? Inferior, deep, superior, or medial? Superior. The eyebrows are located above the eye sockets. How are the cheeks positioned relative to the nose? Lateral, medial, superior, or anterior? Lateral. The cheeks lie to the sides of the nose, making the lateral relationship the most anatomically significant. How is the mouth positioned relative to the chin? Posterior, superior, deep, or inferior? Superior. The mouth is located above the chin. How are the ears positioned relative to the eyes? Anterior, medial, superior, or lateral? Lateral. The ears are positioned toward the side of the head compared to the eyes. How is the temple positioned relative to the eye? Medial, lateral, superior, or posterior? Lateral. The temple is on the side of the head, lateral to the eye. How is the nostril positioned relative to the nasal bridge? Posterior, inferior, superior, or anterior? Inferior. The nostrils are the lower openings of the nose. How is the jaw positioned relative to the temple? Anterior, medial, superior, or inferior? Inferior. The jaw is the lower part of the face. How is the earlobe positioned relative to the pinna? Superior, medial, deep, or inferior? Inferior. The earlobe is the soft, lower part of the external ear. How is the gum positioned relative to the teeth? Lateral, superficial, medial, or deep? Superficial. The gums lie superficially around the base of the teeth. The teeth are positioned deeper within the jaw. How is the tongue positioned relative to the hard palate? Superior, lateral, inferior, or posterior? Inferior. The tongue rests on the floor of the mouth, below the palate. How is the pupil positioned relative to the iris? Peripheral, central, superior, or deep? Central. The pupil is the central opening within the iris. How is the thyroid cartilage positioned relative to the submandibular gland? Deep, inferior, superior, or superficial? Inferior. The thyroid cartilage is in the neck, below the jawline glands. How is the submandibular gland positioned relative to the tongue? Anterior, inferior, lateral, or superior? Inferior. The salivary gland is located beneath the base of the tongue. How is the larynx positioned relative to the pharynx? Lateral, anterior, posterior, or superior? Anterior. The voice box is located in front of the part of the throat behind the mouth. How is the epiglottis positioned relative to the larynx? Posterior, superior, anterior, or inferior? Superior. The epiglottis is a flap located above the glottis, which is the opening of the larynx. How is the frontal lobe positioned relative to the occipital lobe? Posterior, medial, anterior, or inferior? Anterior. The frontal lobe is at the front of the brain, responsible for reasoning and movement. How is the cerebrum positioned relative to the cerebellum? Deep, anterior, inferior, or superior? Superior. The cerebrum is located above the cerebellum. How is the brainstem positioned relative to the cerebellum? Anterior, posterior, lateral, or superior? Anterior. The brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord and is situated in front of the cerebellum. How is the temporal lobe positioned relative to the frontal lobe? Posterior, medial, lateral, or inferior? Lateral. The temporal lobes are located on the sides of the brain, to the side of the frontal lobes. How is the parietal lobe positioned relative to the frontal lobe? Inferior, medial, posterior, or anterior? Posterior. The parietal lobe is located behind the frontal lobe. How is the skull positioned relative to the brain? Medial, proximal, deep, or superficial? Superficial. The skull forms the protective, external bony case for the brain. How is the palate positioned relative to the tongue? Deep, inferior, anterior, or superior? Superior. The palate forms the roof of the mouth, above the tongue. How is the pharynx positioned relative to the oral cavity? Anterior, superior, posterior, or inferior? Posterior. The throat is located behind the mouth. How is the larynx positioned relative to the esophagus? Superior, anterior, lateral, or posterior? Anterior. The voice box sits in front of the food tube in the neck. Where is the temporalis muscle located relative to the masseter muscle? Medial, deep, inferior, or superior? Superior. The temporalis sits above the masseter on the side of the skull. Where is the frontalis muscle located relative to the orbicularis oculi muscle? Deep, posterior, superior, or inferior? Superior. The frontalis is above the eye region where the orbicularis oculi lies. Where is the occipitalis muscle located relative to the frontalis muscle? Posterior, superior, anterior, or medial? Posterior. The occipitalis is at the back of the head, behind the frontalis. How is the trachea positioned relative to the esophagus? Superior, anterior, posterior, or lateral? Anterior. The trachea carries air and sits in front of the food passage. On which aspect of the neck is the Adam's apple located? Anterior, lateral, superior, or posterior? Anterior. The thyroid cartilage prominence is visible on the anterior surface of the neck. On which aspect of the neck is the cervical spine located? Lateral, anterior, inferior, or posterior? Posterior. The cervical vertebrae form the posterior skeletal support of the neck. How is the external jugular vein positioned relative to the sternocleidomastoid muscle? Deep, inferior, medial, or superficial? Superficial. The vein crosses over the muscle surface, making it a superficial landmark. How is the common carotid artery positioned relative to the sternocleidomastoid muscle? Superficial, lateral, posterior, or deep? Deep. This artery runs beneath the musculature, protected deep within the neck. How is the chin positioned relative to the hyoid bone? Superior, anterior, inferior, or posterior? Superior. The chin, part of the mandible, sits above the slender hyoid bone in the neck. How is the hyoid bone positioned relative to the thyroid cartilage? Superior, posterior, deep, or inferior? Superior. The hyoid is suspended above the thyroid cartilage without direct bony contact. How is the thyroid gland positioned relative to the thyroid cartilage? Superior, superficial, inferior, or lateral? Inferior. The thyroid gland wraps the trachea just below the thyroid cartilage. How is the bridge of the nose positioned relative to the eye? Superior, medial, lateral, or deep? Medial. The nasal bridge lies nearer the midline than either eye. The tear duct is on what side of the eye? Posterior, inferior, medial, or lateral? Medial. Tear drainage structures lie at the medial canthus near the nose. On which aspect of the head are the temples located? Posterior, lateral, medial, or inferior? Lateral. The temples mark the thin, lateral regions of the skull beside the eyes. The back of the head is the what region? Parietal, temporal, frontal, or occipital? Occipital. The occipital region overlies the occipital bone at the posterior skull. The pinna is the what part of the ear? Medial, external, deep, or internal? External. The pinna is the external visible cartilage collecting sound waves. How is the tympanic membrane positioned relative to the pinna? Lateral, deep, posterior, or superficial? Deep. The eardrum lies deep within the external auditory canal. How is the cochlea positioned relative to the tympanic membrane? Deep, lateral, medial, or anterior? Medial. The cochlea forms part of the inner ear located medially beyond the eardrum. The mandible is the what bone of the skull? Fixed, mobile, smallest, or deepest? Mobile. It is the only movable cranial bone, enabling chewing and speech. How is the hard palate positioned relative to the soft palate? Inferior, posterior, deep, or anterior? Anterior. The hard palate forms the rigid front portion of the mouth roof, ahead of the soft palate. How is the chin positioned relative to the lips? Superior, anterior, inferior, or medial? Inferior. The chin forms the lower prominence of the face beneath the lips. How is the buccinator muscle positioned relative to the masseter muscle? Superior, superficial, deep, or inferior? Deep. The buccinator lies deeper inside the cheek, underneath the masseter.